Hello, everyone. This is going to be 25.2, continuing on with the 1960s, and we're going to start with a primary source from Bob Dylan's song, The Times They Are a Changin', where he said, "Come, mothers and fathers throughout the land, and don't criticize what you can't understand. Your sons and your daughters are beyond your command. Your old road is rapidly agin'. Please get out of the new one if you can't lend your hand, for the times they are a changin'," and they certainly were in the 1960s. We've already looked at the civil rights movement in class. We have looked at the changing time period of the 1960s a little bit further. Now we are going to look at the New Left of the 1960s. So let's look at Vietnam and the New Left. The rise of what became the New Left started mainly on college campuses in the 60s, and it really kind of came out of nowhere. A lot of these kids were sort of thought to be pretty happy where they were. They were white, they were relatively well off, they were college kids. They'd shown very little interest in protesting before. However, we see what defined the New Left was partially its rejection of old political norms. So these New Left protesters really didn't fit into the old school categories very well. To them, being left wing or being in the New Left didn't mean that you were sort of adhering to the communist line or the socialist line. In fact, they didn't really look to the USSR as a model at all. It also seemed that this was coming from more of a place of anger, loneliness, and isolation, sort of the beat culture take on what they're protesting against. It's on the college campuses, at least at first, they're just kind of protesting against a scattershot group of ills that they don't like. We'll see that it becomes more consolidated as time goes on. They also were borrowing from other protest movements of the time. We see they're borrowing from the civil rights movement. They were protesting wrongs that they felt needed to be addressed at this time. Now, they are getting their ideas, like I said, from a lot of different places. One was James Baldwin's book, The Fire Next Time, and a rejection of racism in America. James Baldwin was considered one of the premier African American writers of his time. We also see that they are influenced by sort of how modern capitalist America is damaging our environment, as seen in the book Silver Spring by Rachel Carson, which describes the environmental impact of all the wealth that we have in the 60s and how it's hurting our ecosystem. Other books discuss things like the destruction of urban centers by cutting highways through them, how the death of cities impacted social interactions, how we were becoming more and more isolated, afraid, lonely, antisocial. These were the things that they were combating. So here's James Baldwin, the author, who said, "I love America more than any other country in the world, and exactly for this reason I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually." And here is Rachel Carson, the author of Silver Spring, who said, "The more clearly we can focus our attention on the wonders and realities of the universe about us, the less taste we shall have for destruction." Now, one of the most influential groups to come out of the New Left was a group called the Students for a Democratic Society, and they met at a place called Port Huron in Michigan, and they released the Port Huron Statement that criticized everything from political parties in general to labor unions, which were usually seen as part of the left during this time. So they're not just focusing on sort of right wing strawmen. They're also focusing on groups in the left wing that they see as problematic as well. They also protested against the military industrial complex. They released a lot of problems, basically, that they saw as issues in the United States. To the SDS and to the New Left, a lot of freedom was more individual. It was not part of joining a big group and having sort of group freedoms. It was individual freedoms and oftentimes rejection of many of the old groups, even as we see with labor unions, groups that are associated with the far left. Joining a group, joining a party restricts your freedoms. So here are some members of the SDS, including one of their leaders, Tom Hayden. He's on the far left up there in 1963. And we can also see what we were talking about here. These are not yet the long-haired hippies of the 1960s. These are white, relatively affluent college kids, basically. They look like they could go to work in any sort of white-collar job tomorrow based on this picture. Now, the rise of SDS. By 1962, the Students for a Democratic Society had over 8,000 members, and their numbers were growing. They were partially growing due to the number of kids on college campuses. So remember, this is, we're reaching the beginning of the baby boom. We're seeing that a lot of the kids born right after World War II are growing up and going to college. Um, and they are expressing their displeasure when people try to stop them. So, for instance, at the University of California, Berkeley, they had recently outlawed student political groups, and so SDS went on to Berkeley's campus to convince them of how wrong they were. They joined with conservative groups who also didn't like the fact that they weren't able to speak freely on the campus, and thousands of Berkeley students participated in a free speech protest for months that ended up criticizing everything from free speech to just how colleges were turning into factories that churned out a bunch of corporate clones and drones. And Berkeley, very soon after this, allowed political groups back on to release pamphlets and discuss their ideas. So here's a guy named Mario Savio who is speaking to protesters at UCal Berkeley. He's standing on top of a police car, and I believe he'll be arrested shortly thereafter. He once said, "There is a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all." So this is a call against sort of the restrictions of personal freedoms that Mario Savio saw during this time. Now, what really concentrated all these different groups into one sort of group, what really gave them sort of purpose was the growing war in Vietnam. And the war showed the danger inherent in viewing many worldwide situations as sort of just the battle against communism, not looking at it with any sort of nuance or anything like that. America got very involved in Vietnam sort of without understanding what we were getting ourselves into. Vietnam had long been part of the French Empire, and eventually we were helping prop up the French as they continued to fight against Vietnamese rebellion, because the Vietnamese rebellion was at least partially communist. However, after the French were defeated, Vietnam was split in two, with America supporting the capitalist South Vietnam. Even though we weren't hugely comfortable with the leadership of South Vietnam, led by Ngo Dinh Diem, he was pretty notoriously corrupt. And as Kennedy is sending more and more advisors, otherwise known as troops, to Vietnam, in the early 60s, Diem was losing control of the countryside. Eventually, his own military captured him and killed him and basically set up a military coup. By the time John F. Kennedy died, there were over 17,000 American troops in South Vietnam, and that number is just going to go up in the next few years. Under Lyndon Johnson. So the assassination of Kennedy brought Lyndon Johnson into office, and he was nervous about sending more troops to Vietnam, but he also realized that if he didn't send troops to Vietnam, he would be branded as the man who lost, Asia to the communists. And so in August 1964, when North Vietnamese patrol boats fired at an American boat in the Gulf of Tonkin, Johnson took immediate action. Congress allowed him to basically do whatever he wanted to stop the aggression from North Vietnam. This is called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, and it basically gave him a blank check to stop the violence in Vietnam however he saw fit. So here's the Vietnam War, 1964 to 1975, give or take-ish. And so we see some of the biggest battles there: the Tet Offensive, the Gulf of Tonkin incidents up in the north, U.S. air raids, the Tet Offensive down south, too. So after his reelection, Johnson was sort of trying to say he didn't want to expand the war any further. However, the Viet Cong attacked again after his election in 65, and so Johnson sent more American troops into Vietnam, and American aircraft attacked up in North Vietnam. And by 1968, there were over 500,000 American troops in the country. The conduct of war on both sides was absolutely brutal. The North Vietnamese were known to capture and torture and set traps for American prisoners of war, holding them sometimes for years. Meanwhile, America was dropping tons and tons of bombs on the North Vietnamese with some really nasty stuff, including what is called napalm, which is sort of like a gasoline that sticks to you and burns you and you can't get it off. They also were dropping deforestation, defoliation chemicals called Agent Orange that ended up being incredibly cancerous on North Vietnam as well. Now, the Americans were killing thousands of North Vietnamese, hundreds of thousands even, both soldiers and civilians. This was another reason why the war in Vietnam was very unpopular, was that when you're fighting a group like this, it was hard to tell the soldiers from the civilians because they sort of wore the same clothes. We couldn't stop the attacks on South Vietnam. This is sort of reminiscent of the issues that the British had with America back in the American Revolution. How do you win not just battles, but win hearts and minds as well? So this is what napalm looked like being dropped. Here is an American soldier named John McCain, who was a prisoner of war for many years in what was called the Hanoi Hilton in North Vietnam. He refused to leave until his fellow inmates were released with him. Later on, he became Senator John McCain, and in 2008 ran against, or 2004, I'm sorry, ran against Obama for the presidency. Now, the Vietnam War did bring together a lot of protest movements in the 60s. So SNCC and other civil rights groups objected to the fact that it seemed to be mainly college kids that were dying in the Vietnam War, or not college kids, the fact that young kids, especially black kids, were dying in this war because college kids were actually exempt from the draft. If you could get into college, you didn't, at least at first, have to go to war. The war was also draining a lot of funds from sort of liberal Great Society programs, leading to more issues with poverty and other issues that the Great Society was supposed to be fixing. To the Students for Democratic Society, the war was the absolute opposite of what they wanted. They wanted, individual freedoms and voluntary democracy. This was a forced war, and it was based on secret backroom deals between Cold War countries. This was just the very opposite of what they were looking for. And as open resistance to the war grew, so did resistance to American policies, where the governments were just siding with dictators because the dictators were not communists. So we see that during this time, Johnson is sending troops to other countries, but people are not liking it because it's basically like, well, why are you sending them there? Well, because we're fighting communists, but is that the only reason we should be doing this stuff? So by 1967, over 100,000 protesters descended on Washington, D.C. They burned, not protest cards, they burned their draft cards. They protested in front of the Pentagon. We see bigger and bigger protests during the Vietnam War. Now, here's a young man burning his draft card, like I said, except I missaid it on the last page. As protesters surrounded the Pentagon, the army marched out to stop them, and we see a protester putting flowers into the gun barrels of the approaching army soldiers. Now, this distrust and even, I would say, hatred of authority led to a very strong movement against the normalized culture of America. So this is called the countercultural movement. It centered a lot on personal freedoms in a lot of different ways. Young people were rejecting cultural norms. They were experimenting with drugs, especially mind-altering psychedelics like LSD. They were experimenting with sex. They were living a much more free life. And this freedom was seen as a rejection of authority. You see a lot of it in the stereotypes of the hippies, bright clothing, rock music, long hair, drug use. They saw it as a symbol of their outward personal freedom, rejecting the suits and ties and clean-cut buzz cuts of the early 1960s. One of the main advocates for this was a former Harvard professor and scientist named Timothy Leary, a psychologist by trade, I believe, who studied at Harvard. He called for young people to expand their mind with LSD, and he called for them to turn on, tune in, and drop out of regular society. So here is Timothy Leary, and he said, natural to me is these botanical species which interact directly with the nervous system. What I consider artificial is 4 years at Harvard, the Bible, St. Patrick's Cathedral, and the Sunday school teachings. So he is saying that the culture is what is unnatural to him, what is artificial. Now, freedom in the counterculture also focused on what leisure and pleasure you could get instead of wealth. It also attempted to free itself from the stricter rules of society. So we see a bunch of different groups sort of in the countercultural movement. One group was called the Youth International Party, or the Yippies. They used a lot of sort of almost like they were almost like the prankster clown princes of the protest movement. They used a lot of political street theater to mock those who adhered and used social norms. So, for instance, they went to the stock market and they dropped dollar bills on the floor, which caused all the stockbrokers to panic and get on their hands and knees and start rooting for the money. They surrounded the Pentagon to perform a mass exorcism because the Pentagon was a five-sided star and that was a symbol of evil to them. They even ran a pig for president called Pegasus. There were over 2,000 communes around the country at this time where people sort of lived outside the norms of society, and many countercultural hippies moved to places like Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco, listening to psychedelic rock and going to Woodstock and things like that. Now, there were some people like Timothy Leary who did advocate for this, but there were also some people who said, look at how they're living. They're living in poverty and squalor, and they haven't taken a shower in months, and they're addicted to drugs. And there was the counter to the countercultural movement as well. So here's a countercultural icon, Abbie Hoffman, one of the founders of the Yippies. He once said that sacred cows make the tastiest hamburgers. And here's some hippies living in Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco. And here are 500,000 of your closest friends living in Woodstock for a few days, listening to music. Now, religion also played a big part in this. We're seeing religious changes during the 1960s. First of all, in Catholicism, Vatican II sort of modernized the Catholic Church. It allowed the Catholic Mass to be preached in the native language instead of Latin. We also see a lot of Catholic priests and nuns joining protest movements, along with Protestant clergymen and rabbis and imams. And protest is multicultural and multi-religious as well. We're also seeing in Latin America the growth of what's called liberation theology, that, blessed are the poor means that the church should help the poor. The church was calling for economic and social equality. There were even guys who were called, depending on how much you liked them, either Jesus people or Jesus freaks, who were out in the streets handing tickets out for God. No, wait, sorry, that's Elton John. Who were... They were saying that basically living the hippie lifestyle is about as close as you're going to get to the way that Jesus and his disciples lived. Meanwhile, other people were sort of experimenting with Asian mysticism, with Hinduism, with Buddhism, and an unfortunate downside to all this are groups like the Manson family and the Jim Jones cult, and so we see sort of messianic cults come about during this time that led to extreme violence as well. So here are a few nuns protesting in the civil rights movement, and I believe those are some priests behind them too. Here are the Beatles, who during their hippie period met with Hindu mystics in order to sort of gain oneness with the universe. And now let's look at 1968. This was a very important year, a climactic year, one of the most important years in American history, I believe, personally. It began in January with the Tet Offensive. Gosh darn it, don't auto-correct me. Tet Offensive. No, it's not Set, it's not T, it is Tet. Tet is the name of the Vietnamese New Year. And on this Vietnamese New Year in January of 1968, the North Vietnamese had a massive invasion of South Vietnam. And while the American army, was able to push the Viet Cong back, it proved that, unlike what the Johnson administration was saying, peace was not around the corner. Victory was not at hand. It looked like we were in a stalemate, or even worse, we might lose. Public support of the war was dropping, especially because we're seeing what's called the oh gosh, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the name of it right now, but the idea that, the White House is saying one thing and the reporters in Vietnam are saying a completely other thing. It's called the credibility gap. That's what it's called. We're seeing the credibility gap expand, and people don't believe what Johnson is saying anymore. It looked like we were losing. So, for instance, here is journalist Walter Cronkite reporting from the Tet Offensive. Gosh, that's bugging me. Sorry. But Walter Cronkite was known as the most trusted man in America. If he said it, people believed it. And one night, Cronkite said, "We're losing. We're losing this war. The best thing we can do right now is to get out." In response to Tet, Lyndon Johnson faced a primary from within the Democratic Party. He was being challenged for the presidency in '68. First of all, we saw an anti-Vietnam senator from Minnesota named Eugene McCarthy, no relation to Joe McCarthy in the '50s, another line of the McCarthy family. Eugene McCarthy shocked Johnson, too, because he got 40% of the vote in an early primary state, and people were like, what? A sitting president is nearly losing to some random nobody from Minnesota? What's happening here? In response to this, after a long couple of years in office, Johnson basically said he was not going to run for re-election in 1968. This made the 1968 Democratic nomination a free-for-all, and as we're going to see, this has dramatic consequences at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Meanwhile, in April '68, Martin Luther King was killed in Memphis, Tennessee, by an escaped convict named James Earl Ray. This is while King was prepping to march in support of the poor. Days of rioting, especially in urban centers of big cities, followed his death. It was almost as if, this is according to a quote that I saw in a documentary once, you wanted to kill the dream, here's a taste of the nightmare. So here's Lyndon Johnson in 1968 listening to I believe it's a kid that he knows. It might not be his son, but it's somebody that he knows, listening to a recording of him in Vietnam. And here is Eugene McCarthy, who said, saying we should keep the two-party system simply because it is working is like saying the Titanic voyage is a success because a few people survived in the life rafts. And here's the assassination of Martin Luther King. They're pointing to where the shot came from right there. Unfortunately, Martin Luther King was nearly instantly killed. At the end of April, we also see the protests expanding. Students at Columbia University were protesting the building of a new gym in what was primarily an African-American section of the areas surrounding Columbia University. We also see that they were protesting the connections that the school had to the Department of Defense. And they actually didn't just protest, they went in and they sort of barricaded themselves into several school buildings. Eventually, the police removed them, injuring dozens of students along the way. After the dropout of Lyndon Johnson, Bobby Kennedy decided that he was going to run for the Democratic nomination. In June, after he won the California primary, he was assassinated by a Palestinian Christian named Sirhan Sirhan, who shot him, people think, because of his... he was shot and killed due to his support of Israel. At least that's what people think. Sirhan Sirhan is a little... He said many things. Now, at the Democratic National Convention, the actual place where they decide, here's who our nominee is going to be, the Democrats, McCarthy was sort of not doing as well. There were other people kind of floating in and out. And then there was Hubert Humphrey, Lyndon Johnson's vice president, who was finally chosen, and Humphrey was sort of seen as like, he's the party candidate. He's the one who is not countercultural. And this led to a full scale riot between protesters and policemen outside the Chicago Democratic National Convention. So here is Columbia in '68. Here is the assassination of Bobby Kennedy. The young man sitting next to him there is a busboy who was gave him a rosary actually as he was dying. And here is the giant protest slash riot, depending on who you ask, outside the Democratic Convention in Chicago in 1968. Now, that's all on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, in response to all this chaos and the fear of sort of, black militancy like the Black Panthers and the Black Power movement, the Republicans went with Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon had made a huge comeback since his loss to Kennedy in 1960. Nixon was saying that he spoke for the law and order people, the people who just wanted peace and stability and order. He said, these are not the people that you see out every day protesting on the streets. They're not loud, they're not noisy. He called them the silent majority of people. And also running was a third party, independent, Alabama Governor George Wallace, the guy who blocked the door at the University of Alabama. He was basically sort of this anti-government firebrand in 1968. He was railing against hippies and African Americans and the Great Society, and he got 10 million votes in 1968. But in the end, Richard Nixon became president, and his win ushered in a new era of conservatism that we were going to see throughout the 70s and 80s. So here's our 37th president, Richard Milhous Nixon, president from 1969 to 74. He's from California. He was a soldier, a congressman, a senator, a lawyer, and vice president of the United States under Dwight Eisenhower. He is thus far the only president we've had who has resigned from office. He also installed a new bowling alley under the White House while he was there. So the 1960s were some of the most important years in 20th century America, and 20th century America was one of the most important centuries in American history. There was a lot of social changes, advances, 2 steps forward, 2 steps back. Medical care was changing, women's rights was changing. We're also seeing that people were not in full agreement about whether or not change was always a good thing. Our country had different opinions regarding what direction we should be moving in, how much change was good, whether change was good, how much is too much, and that also the things that were seen as freedom by the countercultural movement were seen as the problems of America by the more conservative groups, things like drug use, violence, countercultural chaos at that time. So we're seeing the legacy of the 60s is mixed.